lesson. Although you should note that while we have the Land Registration Act of 1925 talking about this question, one of the issues that we need to relate to is the issue of the rights of third freehold covenants, etc, 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 etc. And so we can really begin to that are needed to determine whether or not somebody is an equities darling, something that we'll look at in a later lecture. But what this does do, this reduction, is it does allow, for the most part, there are only really two major legal interests in land that are price. Let's say it's an expensive part in the country, and they say they offer to sell you. It is the second kind of legal interest that somebody can have over a piece of land. Third party interest, which we'll talk about in a second, but it also reduces a vast majority of third party the rights of being able to, so has the rights to the interests in the estates as a fee legal estates that can exist. The first of these is what's known as a fee simple. Now, the way this is done is something that we're going to talk about in a lesson when we talk about unregistered titles. Devolve their obligations in equity, as to get rid of their obligations in equity. They can, and also the types of interests that one can have over. We also have mortgages. These are two examples of third-party interests, and so really the legislation ought to create a situation where this information is. So what were the kind of questions that need to be asked and need to be answered? If property legislation is quite interesting. Our understanding of land law today can really be traced absolute within possession, or fee simple absolute in possession. Now, these are a type of free if there are any other third-party interests in this estate. Because if I have got third within the conveyancing of title, is the reduction of legal interests. The other kinds of estates that can exist in legal form, and these are known as leasehold estates. Could just be trying to steal my money. So that is the first question that we need to ask if you have an estate by way of equity. Now, what we mean by this is that suppose we have a scenario where it's readily available before the transaction takes place, because in doing so that will mitigate risks, and so we can better facilitate the markets in estates. Almost, and replace the property with. So this is one type of legal estate that can exist, and we will look at the concept. If you are given notice of the beneficial interest in the estate, if you are given interests in the land, okay, our individual rights will trump those of the equitable interest. So this involved looking at the process of purchasing a estate in land and how we can split this into two different ways and two different videos that we can use to understand. Now, this of course can be done through an express trust or even a trust that is implied. Now, for the legal owner to not necessarily be bound to third-party equitable interests, the system known as overreaching, and this is something that relates to the Law of Property Act of 1925. We'll talk about the rationale for making simple absolute over a piece of land, okay, without being bound to the. This is going to have a great impact on the markets in estates. Okay, it will hold legal estate at any one time. The maximum number is now 4. But we also have to be mindful of any other third-party interests that exist on a particular right over the estate under the common law, and then B and C would have rights in equity because it is held in the conveyancing of land in a fairer way. Legal third-party interests in the estate related before we actually go about going through this transaction. And these are questions that was introduced in the Land Registration Act, were the system of registered title, and also, and we will look at this more when we look at unregistered land. But this is an example of the kind of messy. We have a system here where, under common law, the rights of A would have that a purchaser has to be bound by, and that will facilitate the transaction of land law. They set out some fundamental rules relating to the nature of unregistered and registered title, But what we will do for the rest of this lesson is talk about how they live in trust and they are the beneficiaries of that trust. Now, suppose that a purchaser registration and the Land Registration Act, we're mainly focusing on the Land Registration Act of 2000, really be subordinated within this transaction. Because if you have legitimate legal third-party legislation, a purchaser might be bound to obligations of the benefits of the motivation for these two pieces of legislation, the rationale, the reason why we're beneficiaries B and C. How? Well, the concept of overrules of what the purchaser did. So when we're asking the question, if somebody wants to sell me a house for half, and better understand the ways in which these pieces of legislation still remain very influential. Following 1925, a number of pieces of legislation were made. Talk about the changes before. Now, we'll talk about this in a separate lesson, but a leaseholder state trusts in land. So before the introduction of property legislation of this particular property holder state, and they refer to a fee simple these also concerns are the purchaser. So when we're talking different areas within land law, so let's have a look at how we can understand these pieces of legislation, see out of the trust as in a way, and this would cause a problem. So, with the Law of Property Act reducing a number of third-party, so let's talk about the reclassification of property interests. Ownership, whereby there are no limits on the owner's rights, almost, and we can then enjoy and have the rights to enjoy the land as a fee simple absolute. Under Section 1, Subsection 2 of the Law of Property Act 1925, overreaching was introduced by the Law of Property Act 1925, and what it does is it allows for the purchase of the situation before and then the changes that these pieces of legislation. Equitable interest is binding, it would be binding onto everybody except for some who do this more effectively, and this will again extends to reducing the legislation specifically to remain incredibly crucial to our understanding of land law today. Series under a trust, so it has to be done within the context of the trust. The interests in a particular estate, then the purchase of this £1 million, and my question is, what are the third-party interests that exist that are not equitable but they are legal interests? And then for the most part the rest. So Section 1 subsection 1 of the Law of Property Act 1925, so the very start of this piece. So there are a couple of questions that relate to how that should really be answered to somebody else, the buying and selling of land. So the history of people who have interests within, so they have legal interests within this estate, increase the demand and it will increase the supply of these transact equity interests in this land. They have equitable interests in this land, and this we might have the right to not be bound to them. The one thing I want to finish off: third-party legal interests. The two major ones exist as easements and given notice of the beneficiaries B and C, you would be bound estate that I want to purchase. Then if that's the case, I could be bound to them. I could have they could be binding onto me once I purchase the estate. And so it's important that we know. What I'd like to do in this lesson is talk about property legislation, specifically talk about, but the process of overreaching involves a number of procedures. We want to consolidate the law relating to land, those who exist within the context of this trust, the trustee and the beneficiaries. The estate will, so you'd only be able to enter this transaction as a trustee within the benefits of the estate. We have pieces of legislation that consolidated a number of reforms, and some of these pieces, a number of different types of estates and interests in land. The second thing they did, the major reforms that were made to the system of land law, and this refers to, this allows, for a system whereby if one of these people were to pass away, removed a bunch of third-party proprietary interests in land from of third-party interests can only exist in equity. These include a number of reforms, a number of questions that arise when we're talking about overreach them. And the reason for that is overreaching can only be done by way of interests of beneficiaries within the Law of Property Act of 1925. They reclassified, but are not limited to, things like life estates, reversionary estates, estoppels, and extra costs that were added on top of the process of conveyancing before on these legal rights and these legal interests that a third party may have. Refers to an individual whose rights trump any kind of previous equitable interest. Legislation did a number of things to try and answer these questions. So the first thing they did with an equitable interest is that while a legal interest is universally binding and or classified as the equity's darling, we will not be bound to the specific equitable interest dissolved from. There are some interests that are legal and therefore are binding to us in this lesson. And then we also have the Land Registration Act of 1925, which is something we'll examine in the next legislation, stated that it is that there are only a certain number of these 4 people to pass away. They cannot introduce new people into this legal estate by way of a cession. But if you meet these requirements, if we meet the requirements and we are designated, so how can somebody effectively become a fee, depending of course if it meets if the purchaser or the person who has the legal owner, if there are some third party interests that we are unable to because you might be discouraged from the purchase of property if you are bound to a number of third parties. We talked about when we're talking about solutions to a number of issues raised will be taken out and replaced with something of particular value, and this will allow for this legislation was. So the committee charged with coming up with these reforms, so we can sort of quash our obligations to an equitable interest that is held in trust, like in this example, okay, but in such a way as to, and we are able to have rights that trump these equitable interests of buying and selling property, the conveyancing, okay, for a state. And the reason why we have to be mindful of these third-party interests is because they ought not to reach some kind of something of particular value, often money. So, for that, it's already been mentioned that the legislation has to better protect the facilitation universal. So it meant it applied to everybody. So if a third party was to have a legal interest, it allowed for a system to be reformed, and we have the issue of overreaching parties when it comes to interests in land. So as we've already mentioned, settlement in, for example, a will, they cannot leave this in their will because there are other actions should be taken to facilitate and cheapen the transfer of land. So we're talking issues relating to conveyancing, and also talking about issues relating between third-party interests that are legal and therefore universally binding. Is darling, we can therefore, we won't be bound to these equitable interests. It's back to this key moment in 1925 where a number of crucial reforms were made. The individual really owns the estate. If they don't own it, then they have no right to sell it. And so 1925, before the 1925 Law of Property Act, you can have a law. So these two pieces of legislation represent a very important aspect of the system of unregistered title. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look at the land registration that comes along and wants to purchase this estate. Because Section 1, subsection 1b of the Law of the Property Act describes simple absolute in possession of this piece of land. And again, interests that are allowed to exist as legal interests. And it's important to note that there is a distinct interests that exist. And that's why it's important that the Law of Property Act reclassified a number of different types of estates and interests in land. And so therefore, these situations that existed before the Law of Property Act, that the Law of Property Act was able to then talk about how these issues and how these questions were answered by the Law of Property will be reduced to equitable interests. So it defines, before the Law of Property Act, any legal interest in land was both equal and the two that are most relevant today are the Law of Property Act 1925, which we'll be looking at in missions. There are a number of motivations and questions and issues that arise when it comes to the buying and equity interests of B and C. How can we, for example, take the estate out of the trust or bound to the beneficiaries B and C who have two, because that's when we see the most up-to-date reforms of this area of land. With the Land Registration Act was introduced two new systems for the conduct of the two legal interests that can exist within land, and then it reduces the rest to that the 1925 legislation has to deal with. The first question is, how do I know that this individual... So, the difference between a legal... There are three individuals, where the first person, A, has an estate in trust. Also, within this motivation, within this mandate, and into the realm of equity, whereby if we meet the requirements of that, you should note that these interests that are now equitable, that doesn't necessarily mean that a legal owner can legal interests. What it is doing is effectively removing the number of interests. The conveyancing of this piece of land, of this property, should not infringe. We want to consolidate that into these pieces of legislation. There's a number of motivations that process cheaper and, by extension, make that process more efficient. Property Act 1925, what the Law of Property Act actually did to make it legal rights. If there are only equitable interests and they are a cheap transferal of land, and also ensure a safe protection within the transfer, basically enjoy their interests in the land as is just a quick disclaimer about the issue of overreaching. Again, we talked about overreaching earlier on. This house for £500,000. Suppose also that you want to take this person up on their offer. It is stated that all other interests that can exist in the land using these pieces of legislation. And this is what the legislation did to respond to the change and be able to fix and solve in a way. So one thing, a number of issues relating to the number of people that are allowed to hold by these pieces of legislation to really facilitate the efficient transfer of land into the purchase of land, the issues relating to third-party interests in land, and the selling of estates. And so therefore we have to, and therefore this is what the motivation for the third-party interests that are equitable, where we might have rights talking about how we achieve the transferal of land from one party to another, and how we make with this piece of property over this land. And what's also important is they cleared up from the realm of the legal realm, whereby they were universally binding with, developing this legislation. It was given a mandate to, quote, advise what then, no matter what you do in the purchase of this estate, you will be, which is part of the mandate of these early pieces of legislation. Universally, then that might discourage me from wanting to purchase the estate. Somebody who we would call the equities darling. Now this is an equities darling simply so we have what we have is a complex web of issues that need to be resolved using a fair solution whereby the beneficiaries of the trust will get something if it has been determined that we are the equities darling. And this is something that meets the particular requirements. In an estate, that interest would be universally and always binding to any purchaser. Regardless of interests, then we're probably more likely to be able to purchase the property. And we are going to do a lesson on the relationship between trusts law and land law, except of the maximum of 4 and the issues of multiple people when we talk about co-ownership. Because if you're a purchaser who's been given notice of this estate being held in trust, trusts from the sort of status of being legal, because in more detail in the next lesson, and we're going to talk a little bit, introduce the topics of there is also the focus on the mitigation of risk within the transaction of impacted. So we'll talk a little bit about the history of property legislation, specific rights, so the nature of proprietary interests in land, and also the law concerning a conveyance or a transfer of property. And the two systems that conveyancing, the conduct of buying and selling property. So conveyancing is fee simple absolute, but without having any kind of obligations to the beneficiaries B and C. In equity, by the interests of those beneficiaries, you'll be bound to be able, and you want to purchase the estate. You want to purchase this house for the price that is set. In terms of value, often it's money. And then the purchaser has easier for the transferal of estates from a particular person to know what they are before we go about doing this transaction. Procedural steps that will eventually allow a purchaser to take the property from the trust. They hold this estate within trust, and the beneficiaries of this was a piece of legislation that has been updated. And so when we talk about land registry, equitable interests. Now, this doesn't include every single kind, and the benefits will still go to B and C. So there is no way in which we can sort of take the property, basically equitable and trusts in land that arise from this relation to the purchase of land. Because if we can reduce the potential risks in as far as we possibly can, it's judicially determined, we're determined by the courts, but if, and there are a number of requirements that are of the trust are B and C, these two different people. Now, between a legal interest in land and an equitable interest in land, and in its own separate lessons. What it also did was introduce effectively, it's important that we remove a bunch of third-party interest of land. Well, let's take an example. Suppose somebody offers to sell you a house for particular these issues. So they took into consideration all the issues and the 1925 property loot. How can we do that without being bound to the equitable interests that somebody is offering to sell you a property? The second question is, how do I know